really random question. How does like the field feel about like 23andMe and these type of like genealogy websites?
It's bullshit.
Yeah.
It's all bullshit for like lots of reasons. One of the key reasons is like, look at it. The scale of your ancestry is so, you have what? Half of the DNA of your parents, a quarter of your grandparents, an eighth of your great-grandparents, so on and so forth. Once you go back like 15 generations, you actually are missing the vast majority of the DNA signatures from each of your ancestors, if you see what I mean. And so they can't reconstruct that. It's actually, you know, the human isopoint. So the isopoint is where you can tell that everybody in a population shares the same ancestors. You might have different inputs from different ancestors statistically, but everybody shares the exact same ancestors. So for Europeans, the isopoint is about 1,000 years ago, which means that every single person alive 1,000 years ago in Europe that has passed on DNA to today, every European has those exact same ancestors. The human isopoint for all of humanity is just a few thousand years ago. And so we all share the same ancestry. We are actually extremely closely related. And so these kind of DNA tests, they tell this very interesting fiction, if you see what I mean, that ignores all the diversity and interrelatedness because of all of our ancestral intermingling that has happened. And the other issue that I find with this kind of studies is they mostly take account of modern DNA. So what it is actually telling you is your DNA statistically is similar to modern people in Ireland. Not necessarily similar to ancient people in Ireland, if you see what I mean.
That's what I was going to say, because I was going to say, and I'd have to read them more particularly because I've never done one of these before, but I don't know if I would say that it's bullshit or they're bad. It's just understanding like it's understanding what exactly they're telling you, which is all they're doing when they do these things. I feel like they say it on, but maybe they don't. All they're doing when they do these things is your DNA, based on the sample that we did, seems like it matches people that are also testing from like this area.
Exactly.
And that's it. That's the extent.
But people interpret that as
2 million years
something
ago,
else,
my
you know?
Irish ancestor.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And when in fact that's not the friggin' case at all, because if you look at the archaeology of Ireland, you can see changes in population structure over time. The Irish population was not the same, if you see what I mean. There's new people coming, there's other people dying, there's who chooses to reproduce and leave, you know, there's all this kind of stuff that goes in there. And the reality, the history of humanity is one of just intermingling in the end.
Yeah,
you know,
I think from, you know, like just from a mere interest perspective, I did, you know, an ancestry thing a little while ago because I was curious because I know my dad's ancestry very well, but my mom was adopted and we don't know very much about where her like parents were from. So I was like, okay, like I'll be able to like I know what my dad is, so I can look at the other half and at least figure out like where her parents were from. So I know my dad is like fully Italian, so I was like, whatever the other 50% is will probably be that. Well, it turns out I'm 80% Italian, so I was like, okay, that's pretty safe to assume one of her parents was probably also fully Italian, and there's, you know, a little bit of Greek, a little bit of Polish, a little bit of something else sprinkled in there. But like that was kind of interesting to be able to get that. And then, you know, extrapolating that out to kind of what you're talking about, like that is like modern, semi-modern Italian, like people who live there now. Like probably a very small part of that data or that DNA goes back to like Romans, you know, like because Italy was like people came into it after the collapse of the Roman Empire. There was like Germanic speaking people that came in and people came from Greece and this and that and the other. So like, yeah, my DNA lines up very well with like modern populations in like central southern Italy. And like that is probably where for the last 300-400 years my, you know, ancestors were. But like that doesn't mean that like, you know, my ancestors were, you know, Roman gladiators or something as cool as that would be. So
I do politics here. Hold on. So because I can't let you get away with that because you showed us your 23andMe yesterday. That 50% we saw was like 100 miles off the west coast of the United States actually for so much of it. It's interesting that now you're denying your Atlantean heritage. But I'm
falsifying the evidence here, man. I'm a scientist. That's what I do.
So if you take a 23andMe and it says like you're 80% from France or anything like that, it's probably reasonable to assume that the last 4 generations of you probably immigrated from France or was from France, but it's probably not much deeper than like 70 to 80 years back in your family history or 120 years. Like it's not going much deeper than that, if that.
And there's obviously confusing signatures there as well because not everybody in France has the same DNA, right? And so like it's sort of like, well, what it means is you're 80% similar to people in France today. But potentially it's the case where your ancestor actually came from Italy, but they had similar DNA to somebody from France, if you see what I mean. And so, because that's the kind of stuff that it can't detect, is it's homogenizing what is actually a fairly heterogeneous group. You know, it's sort of saying this is French DNA, but of course, people living in Italy or Russia had some French DNA. They're just the exception to the rule in that area, if you see what I mean. And so that's where it becomes tricky.
Right, it's
to
comparing you to an
understand it.
aggregate,
Yeah,
essentially.
and so it just means you are similar, closely related to people in France now, on average, who's in France now. Yeah.
Gotcha.